On April 21, 1945, the first Soviet troops stormed into Berlin, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The official narrative, both Soviet and American, has portrayed this invasion as a heroic act of liberation, in which Allied soldiers arrived to save the German people from Hitler's tyranny. But the reality following the fall of the Third Reich was very different. Instead of a peaceful liberation, the country became a living hell for thousands of German women. With the resistance crushed and no moral or legal restraints in place, the invading forces, both from the Red Army and the Western Allies, unleashed a terrifying level of violence against the civilian population. The most vulnerable victims were women and girls, subjected to a horrific fate at the hands of their so-called liberators. What took place on the streets of Berlin and other German cities after the collapse of the Nazi regime has been silenced by official history, but its impact left indelible scars on those who lived through it. This is the hidden truth of the Allied invasion of Germany and the horrifying fate of its women. Welcome to Wartime Archive. Hell in Berlin, the Red Army's revenge. By April 1945, Berlin had become a death trap for the civilians caught in the final major battle of the Third Reich. It is estimated that around 1.5 million women and girls were still in the city at that time, many of them war widows or displaced by the relentless bombardment from Soviet artillery. The city lay in ruins, without drinking water, without electricity, and with food supplies on the brink of collapse. But the worst was yet to come. During the days when Red Army troops laid siege to Berlin, a horror unfolded that is rarely acknowledged in official accounts. Between April 24th and May 5th, 1945, as Soviet forces consolidated control over the city, thousands of German women were subjected to brutal assaults. It is estimated that at least 1 in 3 women in Berlin experienced some form of sexual violence during those days, a devastating reality documented in the diaries and testimonies of survivors. The fall of Berlin not only marked the end of Nazism, but also the beginning of one of the most ruthless episodes of retribution in World War II. The Third Reich's last line of defense consisted of exhausted soldiers, elderly members of the Volkssturm militia, and teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, many of them with no real combat experience. With the city under siege and resistance shattered, the Red Army advanced mercilessly, sweeping through every neighborhood in its path. Official figures estimate over 900,000 German casualties and 360,000 Soviet and Polish losses in the Battle of Berlin. But beyond these numbers lay a silenced horror. Reports of women being repeatedly assaulted by groups of soldiers, many of whom did not survive the attacks. While exact figures are difficult to confirm, historians estimate that between 20,000 and 100,000 women were victims of this brutality in Berlin alone. Across Germany, the estimates reach up to 2 million. Yet what happened in Berlin was not an isolated event. The violence unleashed by Soviet troops was fueled in large part by years of suffering, propaganda, and the thirst for revenge. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, had left behind a trail of massacres, executions, and total destruction across Soviet territories. Hitler had ordered a war of annihilation on the Eastern Front, in which Soviet cities were razed, civilians slaughtered, and prisoners of war treated with extreme cruelty. The Red Army had suffered enormously. The USSR lost more than 27 million people during the war. The Soviet soldiers marching on Berlin were not just hardened fighters, they were survivors of Germany's devastation. Stalin's propaganda further stoked hatred against Germans, and when Soviet troops finally crossed into the Reich, they did so not only with the goal of victory, but with a deep desire for vengeance. The fall of Berlin was the climax of a war driven by hatred and destruction. The brutality of the Red Army's advance was further intensified by the alcohol found in cellars abandoned by retreating Germans. As Soviet forces liberated their compatriots from Nazi prison camps, their anger and bitterness grew. In Berlin, German resistance was fought street by street, with civilians and soldiers defending their homes to the last breath in a desperate and hopeless battle. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had ordered the population to resist to the death, claiming the city would become an impenetrable fortress. But reality proved otherwise. Berlin fell, and with it, the promise of a glorious resistance was consumed by fire, destruction, and unimaginable suffering for those left inside. The daily hell in Berlin: violence, disease, and abortions in the post-war period. During the first months of the Allied occupation in Berlin, abuse against women became a terrifying routine. In a society devastated by war, where death and hunger were part of everyday life, attacks on women and girls were met with indifference, both by the perpetrators and the authorities. There were no protests, no punishments. It simply happened. For many women, this hell was just one more layer of the tragedy they had already endured. They had lost their homes to bombings, seen their husbands die at the front, their children fall ill and perish from malnutrition, their parents die from untreated diseases. Amid this grim reality, the systematic violence against them became just another form of daily suffering. Even within German society, some justified these acts as an inevitable consequence of defeat. The assaults were brutally carried out, with women attacked publicly and in groups. Some were murdered immediately after being violated, their bodies left in the streets in nightmarish scenes. Others were mutilated, victims of extreme violence seemingly intended to leave a lasting mark of humiliation on the conquered population. To this brutality was added the devastating toll on the victims' health. Many became pregnant as a result of these attacks, facing the agonizing decision of whether to give birth to a child conceived through violence or risk undergoing a clandestine abortion. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly, affecting thousands of women who were already suffering from malnutrition and lack of medical care. The medical and social consequences were so severe that authorities, both the Nazis in the dying days of the Reich and the occupying Allied forces, were forced to intervene. In Berlin, a medical commission was established in 1945 to approve or deny abortion requests. In many cases, abortions were authorized even in the final months of pregnancy. For a request to be approved, women had to certify that they had been assaulted by a foreigner, meaning their cases were officially recorded, adding further stigma to the victims. Nevertheless, many women turned to underground procedures. It is estimated that between 1945 and 1948, nearly 2 million abortions per year were performed in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. Those who couldn't access official procedures paid exorbitant prices for operations performed without anesthesia, often in unhygienic conditions. It is estimated that around 6,000 women died each year due to medical complications from these practices. Although abortion was not legalized in the occupied zones, local authorities, the Protestant Church, and the Allied governments tolerated the practice as an urgent necessity. However, the Catholic Church fiercely opposed it, condemning any attempt to terminate pregnancies, regardless of the circumstances in which they had occurred. The end of the war brought peace, but for German women, it marked the beginning of a silent struggle for survival, health, and dignity in a shattered society. The desperate cry of women to decide over their own bodies. During the Nazi regime, abortion was regulated according to the racial ideology of the Third Reich. While reproduction among the Aryan population was actively promoted, forced abortions were carried out on groups deemed undesirable. However, by the end of the war, the situation took an unexpected turn. German women victims of abuse during the occupation found themselves in urgent need of access to safe abortions. Berlin, devastated and plunged into chaos, witnessed thousands of women turning to newly established medical commissions set up by the Allies to request the termination of unwanted pregnancies. These commissions operated in hospitals, and although supervised by anti-fascist doctors, many of the individuals in charge of the procedures had been involved in Nazi racial policies just months earlier. Ironically, some of the same doctors who had carried out forced sterilizations and euthanasia programs were now overseeing the abortions of women trying to cope with the horrors of war. but not all women could or wanted to submit to the scrutiny of these commissions. Fearing stigma, many turned to underground methods. Illegal abortions, often performed in precarious conditions, resulted in thousands of deaths due to infections and medical complications. It is estimated that in the Soviet zone of Germany, more than 6,000 women died annually between 1945 and 1948 as a result of failed procedures. The Nazi rhetoric of racial hygiene did not immediately disappear after Hitler's defeat. Many women, desperate to obtain the right to an abortion, resorted to the prejudices instilled by Nazi propaganda. They exaggerated or invented details about their attackers, describing them with racial stereotypes in hopes that their requests would be more easily approved. Among the few doctors who openly opposed Nazism and continued working after the war was Anne-Marie Durand-Weber. This anti-fascist physician dedicated her efforts to treating victims of sexual violence and detecting venereal diseases. Tragically, even her own daughter suffered firsthand the horrors of the occupation. Durand-Weber became an activist for sexual education and family planning, co-founding in 1952 an organization aimed at advising women on their reproductive rights. For many German women, the fall of the Third Reich did not signify the arrival of freedom, but rather the beginning of a silent struggle to regain control over their own bodies. The difficult task of surviving in a war-torn Berlin. For the German women who lived through the fall of the Third Reich, defeat did not mean the end of suffering. In addition to facing violence and humiliation, many had to take on the role of providers and protectors in a shattered city. Without access to basic supplies, with their homes destroyed and in the absence of husbands or fathers, women became the main caretakers of their families in a chaotic and hostile environment. The black market emerged as the only way to obtain food and shelter. In these desperate exchanges, many women were forced to trade not only valuable belongings, but also their own safety. The protection of their children and of themselves depended on the occupying Soviet and American forces, who in many cases took advantage of the situation to impose exploitative conditions. In exchange for food rations, shelter, or simply to avoid further assault, some women were forced into prostitution or exploitative relationships. The arrival of the Allies had been greeted with relief by many, who saw the foreign soldiers as a promise of freedom after years of Nazi oppression. However, that sense of hope soon turned into despair as the occupation became another kind of nightmare. One of the most harrowing testimonies is that of Inga Deutschkron, a young Jewish woman who had spent much of the war in hiding with her mother to avoid deportation. When the Red Army entered Berlin, Inga believed her nightmare was over. She thought that, as a Jewish survivor, the Soviets would protect her, but the reality was very different. When she encountered a Soviet soldier, she greeted him with a smile of relief, only to be violently grabbed. Not fully understanding what was happening, she ran to her mother for help. Believing that their Jewish identity would grant them protection, her mother told her to retrieve her identity card. But the soldiers showed no interest in her story, only in her body. The young woman was chased and attacked, first on the street and then inside an abandoned building. Her account describes in chilling detail how, in the midst of devastation, the soldiers' humanity had vanished. Inga stopped feeling, stopped resisting. She only hoped that once they were done with her, they would leave her alone. Her story is just one of the thousands that unfolded in Berlin in 1945. Stories that have faded into obscurity over time, but remain a powerful testimony to the horror that accompanied the fall of the Third Reich. The behavior of the Allied troops, abuse and silence during the occupation of Germany. Up to this point, it has become clear that Red Army soldiers committed countless atrocities against German women following the fall of Berlin. However, this leads us to an inevitable question. Did American soldiers behave any differently? Throughout 20th century history, the United States and the Soviet Union positioned themselves as rivals, each trying to prove the moral superiority of its system to the world. For decades, Western propaganda portrayed American soldiers as honorable heroes, in contrast to the brutal image of the Soviets. Images circulated of US soldiers being welcomed with open arms by liberated populations, handing out candy to children, and celebrating the end of the war in an atmosphere of joy and equality. However, the reality of the American occupation in Germany was far from this idealized version. Unlike their entry into France, where they arrived as liberators and behaved like respectful guests honoring local customs, Americans viewed Germany as conquered territory. Years of war propaganda had instilled a deep hatred for anything German, which for many soldiers justified abusive and criminal behavior. In their minds, Germans were nothing more than vermin, defeated enemies, undeserving of any kind of compassion. This contempt manifested itself in looting, destruction, and attacks on the civilian population. German women were no exception. For many American soldiers, the conquest of German women served two purposes. On one hand, they were seen as war trophies, a symbol of the enemy's total defeat. On the other, their subjugation acted as a form of cultural and psychological humiliation over the vanquished. The abuses began even before American troops set foot on German soil. In Normandy, after the landings, American soldiers had already committed crimes against the French population. Women in the liberated towns became victims of soldiers who, under the pretense of bringing freedom, acted with complete impunity. These same practices were then carried into Germany, and in many cases, intensified. One of the factors that contributed to this wave of violence was the permissiveness within the US military itself. At the time, high-ranking officials were deeply concerned about moral weakness and the risk of homosexuality within their ranks. To counter this, promiscuity among soldiers was encouraged, with sexual assault normalized as a lesser evil within a force that had been at war for years. Although there are no official records documenting the full extent of the crimes committed by American troops in Germany, hundreds of testimonies and documents have emerged over time, revealing a history that was silenced for decades. The idea that Allied soldiers were the unblemished heroes of the war begins to fall apart when the horrors of the occupation are examined. Just like the Soviets, the Americans left a dark mark on Germany's post-war history. Although propaganda sought to conceal these events, the suffering of German women remains a stark reminder that in times of war, the abuse of power knows no flag. When the American dream turned into a nightmare for German women. Throughout World War II, German women were exposed to propaganda from multiple fronts. Although the Nazi regime maintained strict control over all information circulating within Germany, the idea of the American dream managed to seep through and capture the imagination of many. The image of a prosperous life in the United States, of heroic soldiers returning home to build a future with their wives, seemed like an idyllic destiny compared to the devastation they were facing in their own country. For many German women, the American occupation represented a hope of escaping the misery left behind by the war. They believed that meeting a brave, strong, and generous American soldier might allow them to start a new life far from the ruins of Berlin, Frankfurt, or Munich. However, for many, that hope turned into a bitter nightmare. It wasn't only German women who saw American soldiers as a path to a better future. Within the US Army itself, African American soldiers encountered a very different reality in Germany than what they had known in their own country. At that time, the United States was a segregated nation, where black men could fight alongside white comrades, but not ride the same buses or marry white women. The war offered them a brief escape from segregation, and many believed that in Germany, they would have more opportunities to engage in interracial relationships without the discrimination they faced back home. However, these interactions were often marked by violence. On the outskirts of Munich in 1946, a fruit vendor was attacked by two American soldiers. She was walking alone when a military van stopped in front of her. One of the soldiers threatened her with a rifle and ordered her to get in. When she refused, he assaulted her in broad daylight, while his companion watched without intervening. After the first assault, the second soldier took her to a wooded area and forced her to endure another. Afterward, the soldiers tried to bribe her with cigarettes and chocolate, a scene that reveals the impunity with which they acted and the contempt with which they viewed their victims. Another harrowing case occurred in Würzburg, where a 15-year-old girl was attacked by a group of 8 American soldiers. Years later, every time she tried to recount what had happened, she would break down in tears. Her case went to court, but instead of receiving support, she was subjected to medical examinations that made her feel re-victimized. Even a decade after the crime, the legal system seemed more inclined to protect the perpetrators than to seek justice for the victims. These episodes, silenced for decades, reveal a dark side of the American occupation of Germany. While propaganda portrayed Allied soldiers as liberators, the reality for many women was entirely different. In a devastated country where protection and justice were scarce, they became easy prey for the very men who were supposed to represent victory and freedom. Post-war impunity, the complicit silence of justice. Despite the scale of the crimes committed against German women by Allied forces, those responsible rarely faced consequences. Even when victims gathered the courage to report the assaults, the chances of their cases going to trial and resulting in a conviction were minimal. The main barrier to justice was the legal system itself. It was frequently argued that American soldiers should be tried by military courts rather than subjected to German civil justice. These tribunals, operating under the jurisdiction of the US military, were notoriously lenient with their own members, often reducing sentences or acquitting the accused altogether. Over the years, reports of attacks continued to pile up. In just the last 3 months of 1952, the Bavarian Minister of the Interior received 227 reports of serious incidents involving American soldiers. Of those, 18 were attempted sexual assaults. By the end of 1953, the number of complaints had risen to 260. For many women in Germany, the fear of being attacked by American soldiers had become a daily reality. One of the most scandalous cases occurred in 1959, when a 12-year-old girl was assaulted and the perpetrators were immediately released. Public outrage spread throughout Bavaria, sparking protests and calls for the German government to act against the abuses committed by the occupying forces. Religious and political leaders demanded answers from the Foreign Ministry, pressuring the authorities to ensure the safety of German women and girls. But the abuse did not end in the 1950s. In 1963, in the city of Gelnhausen, Hesse, where the US 3rd Armored Division was stationed, reports emerged of theft, vandalism, and street violence committed by American soldiers. Among the reported crimes, numerous cases involved sexual assaults against local women, showing that the violence of the occupation extended even 2 decades after the war had ended. In some cases, abuse involved not just physical violence, but also emotional manipulation. Some women were forced into exclusive relationships with soldiers, kept completely isolated in rooms where they saw only their aggressor. For many, these situations amounted to prolonged captivity, where abuse was disguised as a false romance. Other women, in desperate attempts to protect their daughters, offered themselves to soldiers in hopes of sparing their children from assault. These forced relationships often led to complex, contradictory emotions in the victims. In an environment of violence, hunger, and despair, some developed Stockholm Syndrome, feeling affection or even desire toward their abusers. The line between prostitution, coercion, and systematic abuse became blurred in a context where German women had neither options nor safety. The silence of the authorities and the lack of consequences allowed these abuses to continue for years, leaving an indelible scar on the history of the Allied occupation of Germany. Brave women rebuilding their country and families. Undoubtedly, the greatest tragedy faced by German women after World War II was the fact that the burden of rebuilding the country fell on their shoulders. After years of food shortages, personal losses, daily humiliation, and even sexual assaults, These women were expected to keep working and raise healthy children in broken homes. Women had played a central role in Adolf Hitler's plan to create an ideal Aryan community. Praised as his most loyal and fanatical companions in battle, Hitler valued women not only for their activism within the Nazi movement, but also for their biological role as bearers of the race. In Nazi ideology, a larger and racially purer population would increase Germany's military strength and provide settlers to colonize conquered territories in Eastern Europe. The aggressive population policy of the Third Reich encouraged racially pure women to have as many children as possible. According to Nazi Party propaganda, a woman's place was strictly in the home, as mothers and procreators. It was their husbands who were meant to work, earn money, and determine the fate of the nation. Now, after the military and political defeat of Nazism in Germany, the role of women in the post-war family ideally continued along the same lines. But now they had to do everything else as well. Domestic labor or unpaid work was still considered a service to the family, the nation, and the country. Women were expected to give birth to and raise the builders of capitalist or communist Germany. By the 1950s, female-headed households had become the core of Germany's reconstruction in every respect. This was true both in West Germany, controlled by France, Britain, and the United States, and in East Germany, the communist part of the country. The term Trümmerfrauen became common in post-war Germany. Literally translated as rubble women, their specific job was to clear the debris from bombed cities and rebuild them. It's estimated that 3.6 million homes were destroyed in 62 German cities due to Allied bombings, leaving 7.5 million people homeless. These women had the Herculean task of collecting and moving 500 million cubic meters of rubble, roughly 150 times the volume of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Trümmerfrauen, both volunteers and paid workers, labored in all weather conditions. They were organized in groups of 10 to 20. Their enormous contribution to Germany's reconstruction is often forgotten and is even more remarkable given the harsh conditions they were forced to endure. In West Germany's post-war politics, conservatives tended to encourage women to have 2 or more children. Meanwhile, Social Democrats often argued that men's wages should be raised to properly support women and their families. Neither side questioned the idea that women should once again be confined to the domestic sphere. In the immediate post-war years, the German state had to develop welfare solutions for families led by single mothers due to the shortage of men. But once that situation began to shift, being a single woman once again became socially undesirable. Despite all the hardship and sacrifice endured over the previous decades, the social position of German women changed very little after the war. In fact, it could be argued that their status became even worse than before. Although the Nazi regime had tolerated procreation outside of marriage in the interest of increasing the birth rate, it was still considered an exception to the rule of legal marriage. The family-related solutions that the defeated countries had to come up with were much more difficult than those of the victors. Women had to care for children and adults unable to work, often receiving very little state assistance. This lack of support was a major obstacle to returning to the normal family model, as many healthy adult men avoided relationships with widows or women who already had children. These women became undesirable, yet they were essential to rebuilding and expanding this industrial nation. Another way women were stigmatized was through the spread of venereal diseases. The US government created a cartoon character named Veronika Dankesjohn, a clear reference to venereal disease. Veronika was depicted as an unhealthy seductress meant to scare American soldiers into ending their sexual relationships with German women. As German men began returning home, they started calling these women prostitutes. It is believed that this behavior was a way for the men to express their anger and inner conflict over the fact that their partners had been forced to sell themselves to survive, while they, the men, had now also become dependent on women, Western women as guardians of the German spirit. The new authorities emphasized women's reproductive role, just as under Nazism, as essential to the proper functioning of society in all aspects. But now, women were also tasked with raising their children with good Christian values. Their mission was to teach them to resist the temptations of a rising consumer society, one that heralded the economic miracle of German recovery, while also instilling values in which work and sacrifice remained the highest symbols of honor. Despite living under American patronage, West Germans sought to differentiate themselves, at least in values, from the Americans who had defeated them. In this mission, women played a key role. They were expected to instill the right values in their children to prevent them from falling into the same excesses seen in the consumerist society, and the same behaviors that American soldiers had demonstrated in occupied German lands. Women were tasked with preserving the spirit of German society above materialist values. Women also needed to guard themselves. Those forced to work outside the home because they were alone also had to resist the temptation of unrestrained consumption. In this effort, both Protestant and Catholic churches became guides for many single women. Despite previously mentioned differences between conservatives and socialists, there was widespread consensus in West Germany that women and family should once again be above all a private matter. The family was to be that intimate, inviolable place, marking the greatest contrast between post-war Germany and Nazi efforts to make the family a public institution. Once the rubble was cleared and some German men returned home, the initial wave of reports about sexual violence was gradually silenced. In East Germany, the Soviet administration attempted to suppress all efforts by German communists who wanted to address the issue publicly. They aimed to reverse the image their Russian comrades had left in the lives of German women, many of whom had once voted for the German Communist Party. Though silenced, women found ways to express their discontent through democracy. In 1946, during the first open elections in Berlin, the Communist Party lost to the Social Democrats, partly because it had lost the majority of the female vote. Women, some of them former communists, had not forgotten what the Soviet comrades had done to them and their friends or relatives. With the return of prisoners of war and the reintegration of women into the home, the issue faded from the press and public discourse. Not only because it was too shameful for the women, but also because it was humiliating for the German men, who had to bear the stigma that their wives had been assaulted or had affairs during their absence. In other words, in the West, these accusations were shamefully swept under the rug. In East Germany, the German state under Soviet influence aimed to urgently address the needs of women and families, guaranteeing women's status and supporting their domestic work. But due to its egalitarian communist values, it also promoted the image of a more independent woman, dedicated, hard-working, and professional, committed to building socialism in Germany. Unlike their Western counterparts, many East German women with conservative values felt compelled to leave their homes and enter the workforce to become independent from men, as imposed by the socialist state. Assaulted by the American invasion from the West, by the Soviets from the East, and by years of hardship under Hitler's regime, the post-war reality for German women was a living hell. Mass assaults, sexualization and fetishization, venereal diseases, unwanted pregnancies, a rise in abortions, and the stigma and marginalization from their own people were just some of their most pressing concerns. On top of all this, women had to keep their traumatic experiences secret. But even after enduring the worst of the war, both the capitalist system of the West and the communist system of the East once again placed women at the center of Germany's reconstruction, whether in reproductive and educational roles or as workers filling the absence of men. The sacrifice of these women became the cornerstone of Germany's post-war miracle.